December 12, 1974, Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. A gray December sky pressed down over the narrow streets. The air smelled of diesel and wet asphalt. At 3:47 a.m., a lone street lamp flickered outside a modest Italian-American apartment. Inside, the silence was shattered by a single, muffled scream. Neighbors later recalled a car peeling away, tires squealing on cracked pavement. On the floor of apartment 3B lay Joseph Spider Lombardo, mid-30s, small but wiry, a rising capo in the Colombo family. His chest bore a single gunshot wound, but the scene was puzzling. No signs of robbery, no forced entry, nothing taken. The police assumed a typical mob settling of scores, but the truth was far stranger. Spider hadn't been killed for betrayal, money, or territory. His murder traced back to a shadowed feud that stretched beyond Brooklyn, into the marble halls of Manhattan's political elite, into the very offices that were supposed to protect law and order. He had discovered something dangerous, and for the Colombo family, that was far worse than defiance. Tonight, we peel back the myths. We expose the reality that Hollywood and Goodfellas never dared to show. If you want the full story behind the murder they lied about, watch closely and don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Joseph Spider Lombardo was born January 22, 1940, in a cramped Bensonhurst apartment, the youngest of 5 siblings. His father, an Italian immigrant laborer, worked long hours on the docks, rarely at home, leaving Joseph to navigate the streets with his older brothers. His mother, a strict but loving woman, tried to shield him from the neighborhood's creeping criminality. But Bensonhurst in the 1940s and 50s was a crucible. Children learned early which streets to avoid and which ones offered opportunity. Spider was clever, wiry, and fiercely independent. By age 12, he had mastered the local card games, small-time hustles, and most importantly, the art of observation. He watched older men with respect and fear, noting how reputation could bend reality. Spider's adolescence was punctuated by violence. Fights at school, skirmishes with rival gangs, a few arrests for petty theft. Yet he carried a quiet intensity, a calculating patience. Unlike many of his peers who sought instant notoriety, Spider studied people, alliances, weaknesses, and loyalty. His nickname, Spider, came not from brutality but from his uncanny ability to weave networks. Friends, enemies, informants, and rivals all moved across his web without realizing the connections he maintained. Psychologically, Spider balanced charm with intimidation. He could enter a room and make friends, yet the hint of menace lingered just beneath the surface. This duality made him dangerous, approachable, yet unreadable. Family loyalty was central. While he drifted toward the streets, he never abandoned his mother's household, often supporting his siblings. But loyalty had limits. Spider learned early that in organized crime, moral codes were negotiable, and a single misstep could be fatal. It was this combination, street smarts, patience, charisma, and an instinct for power, that set him apart. While Hollywood would later reduce him to a caricature of mob bravado, the real Spider Lombardo was a product of circumstance, intellect, and survival instincts sharpened by decades in a neighborhood where life and death often balanced on the same knife's edge. By the early 1960s, Spider Lombardo had left petty hustles behind. Bensonhurst streets had taught him the rules, but the Colombo family would teach him the game of power. His first introduction came through Anthony "Tony" Rinaldi, a mid-level capo who recognized Spider's potential, not in brute strength, but in calculation. Spider began with small jobs, collecting debts, running numbers, handling protection rackets. Unlike others, he approached every task with meticulous attention. A botched collection could escalate into a vendetta. Spider learned to read tension in a room before anyone else. He built a reputation for reliability. Men trusted him to handle delicate situations, and they feared him when necessary. Within 5 years, Spider moved from enforcer to trusted associate. His rise was not just about loyalty, but about vision. He observed the family's hierarchy: capos, soldiers, associates. Every role had influence, but few had insight. Spider had both. He noted rivalries simmering beneath surface agreements, the ways the family's wealth and political connections intertwined, and the fragile loyalties that could fracture overnight. His first sanctioned hit, a high-profile loan shark who betrayed the family, was executed with precision. Spider learned the art of psychological terror, intimidation, timing, and message sending. The hit wasn't just about revenge, it reinforced order. Every family member understood that disloyalty had consequences. Spider's reputation soared. By 1970, Spider was not merely rising. He was central to the Colombo's Brooklyn operations. He managed crews, coordinated shipments of illicit goods, and acted as a liaison with Manhattan's higher-ups. Political connections became essential. Bribes, favors, and subtle threats ensured law enforcement looked the other way. Spider understood that the streets were only half the battle. Power in the offices of the city mattered just as much. Yet the higher he climbed, the more complex the webs became. Allies became rivals, rivalries became enemies, and the smallest mistake could echo through every level of the family. Spider's intelligence and foresight made him indispensable, but it also painted a target on his back. By the time he was 30, Spider Lombardo was no longer just a rising soldier. He was a man who understood the architecture of power, the delicate balance of fear and loyalty, and the cold calculus that governed life and death inside the Mafia. By 1972, Spider Lombardo had reached a critical juncture. Brooklyn's underworld was stabilizing after decades of turf wars, but a new threat loomed, not from rival families, but from the corridors of power above. Spider stumbled onto it almost by accident. During a routine collection from a construction contractor, he uncovered discrepancies in city permits. The contractor, sweating, mentioned that bribes had been funneled through a councilman's office to ensure certain contracts went only to approved companies. Spider, trained to notice leverage, realized this was bigger than a local graft scheme. These were systemic connections: politicians, labor unions, law enforcement, all intertwined with the Colombo family's operations. At first, Spider weighed silence. The Mafia thrived on discretion, but he was curious. Over the following months, he pieced together a hidden network: kickbacks, construction fraud, illegal gambling, revenue siphoned through shell corporations. Spider understood the stakes. This knowledge was dangerous. A map that could topple alliances if exposed, and yet it gave him unparalleled power. His rise inside the family now had a new dimension. Capos sought his counsel not just for enforcement, but for strategy. Spider proposed ways to exploit these political connections to expand territory and revenue while minimizing risk. Some elders resisted, wary of the exposure, but Spider argued coldly, "We control the streets. If we don't control the offices above them, someone else will." This turning point also marked the beginning of Spider's enemies multiplying. Ambitious soldiers and capos saw him as a threat, a bridge between the family and the city's elite. Suspicion simmered. Spider's intelligence and foresight, once assets, now drew scrutiny. The very skills that had elevated him were now a source of paranoia within the family. In late 1973, a close associate vanished. No explanation. Rumors whispered through Bensonhurst. Some believed it was a message, others feared it was Spider's own making. The disappearance was a warning. Knowledge was power, but power could provoke fatal consequences. Spider had entered a dangerous zone. He was no longer just climbing the Mafia ladder. He was operating in a space where politics, corruption, and criminal enterprise converged. Every decision carried weight. Every alliance required calculation. The stage was set for a collision that would not just threaten him personally, but shake the foundations of the Colombo family itself. By 1974, Spider Lombardo's discoveries had placed him at the intersection of crime and politics. Brooklyn streets were no longer the limit of his influence. The city itself had become a chessboard, with mayors, councilmen, and police chiefs as unwitting or complicit players. Spider realized that the Colombo family's survival depended not solely on fear and enforcement, but on manipulation of the political machinery. He began quietly documenting payments, favors, and backroom deals, ledgers that could topple careers if revealed. These were not mere bribes. They were tools of leverage, instruments to control zoning approvals, labor union decisions, and even judicial outcomes. But the closer he drew to this power, the more dangerous it became. Certain politicians, aware of the family's reach, started probing. Rumors spread of unaccounted wealth and mysterious deaths tied to organized crime. Spider understood the delicate line. Too bold, and the law would intervene. Too timid, and rivals within the family might preemptively strike to protect their own positions. The political entanglements also exposed fractures within the Colombo family. Some elders wanted to maintain traditional operations, loan sharking, gambling, and enforcement. Spider advocated for calculated expansion, leveraging political influence to ensure legal protection and maximize revenue. Younger capos aligned with him, but older, cautious figures saw him as reckless, a dangerous bridge between the streets and City Hall. Spider's position was enviable but isolating. Trust became currency, paranoia a constant companion. Every meeting in smoke-filled back rooms required subtle reading, which allies were loyal, which officials had been compromised, and which opponents plotted in silence. By summer 1974, Spider's political maneuvering drew national attention. A federal investigation into municipal corruption had begun to trace anomalies back to Brooklyn, and the Colombo family, Spider included, felt the growing pressure. Law enforcement was no longer a distant threat. They were encroaching into Spider's carefully constructed networks. The tension was unbearable. Every action had consequences beyond the neighborhood streets. Spider's growing influence, once his greatest asset, now painted a target across his back. Allies became cautious, rivals opportunistic, and politicians hesitant. It was clear. Spider was navigating a world where loyalty was fragile, visibility lethal, and the consequences of a misstep irreversible. The stage was set not for survival, but for betrayal, and for a murder that would shock Bensonhurst and rewrite the story of the Colombo family forever. By late 1974, Spider Lombardo found himself walking a razor's edge. The streets that had once been his proving ground were no longer safe. His ascent into political corridors had alienated old allies. Friends became cautious observers, associates whispered behind closed doors, and rivals watched for the smallest misstep. The very qualities that had elevated Spider, intelligence, foresight, and ambition, now marked him as a threat. Within the Colombo family, resentment festered. Older capos viewed his political ambitions as reckless, younger soldiers envied his influence. Rumors began circulating. Spider was too close to the politicians, playing a dangerous game, and perhaps worst of all, uncontrollable. Isolation was not only social but operational. Meetings once held with trusted lieutenants were now monitored. Every decision he made, every ally he consulted, had the potential to leak to enemies. In mafia terms, this was the slow strangulation of power. Before a man falls, his support network is quietly eroded. Spider, aware of the tightening noose, tried to navigate the tension. He strengthened bonds with those who shared his vision, rewarding loyalty with opportunity. Yet trust became a scarce commodity. Even the most devoted associates hesitated to speak openly. Fear had entered the room alongside ambition, and Spider understood instinctively that betrayal could arrive from any quarter. The first overt warning came in November 1974. A shipment of illicit goods he had personally overseen was sabotaged, and an anonymous note arrived. Knowledge has a cost. No name, no signature, just a message that cut deeper than any bullet. Spider knew who it implied. Someone close, someone calculating, someone within the family. As the month progressed, he noticed subtle signs of surveillance. Familiar faces loitered near his apartment, calls went unanswered, and the police seemed unusually informed of his movements, likely tipped off by someone inside the Colombo network. Every interaction was now a calculated risk. Every glance, a possible betrayal. Spider's isolation was complete. Surrounded by enemies he once called allies, he became hyper-aware of the fragility of power. In organized crime, knowledge is both armor and arrow. Spider's intelligence had secured his rise, but it had also painted a target on his chest. And in the weeks to come, that target would become fatal. December 12, 1974. Spider Lombardo's life ended not in a blaze of chaos, but in the cold precision of a calculated strike. The streets of Bensonhurst, quiet in the early morning, became the theater of a murder that would haunt the family for decades. Spider had returned from a late-night meeting with a politically connected contractor. The snow, light but persistent, coated the sidewalks. He entered apartment 3B. Unaware that his movements had been tracked, that every step he took had been anticipated. The betrayal was intimate. The perpetrators were men he had trusted, men who understood his routines, his habits, his weaknesses. Inside the apartment, the door clicked shut behind him. A single gunshot echoed. Spider fell against the wall, his body slumping to the floor in the stillness. It was swift. There was no struggle, no chance for warning. Those who carried out the execution had studied him, learned his patterns, and struck at the precise moment of vulnerability. The murder was not only a message but a statement. Knowledge and ambition within the Mafia came at a cost. Spider's death silenced him, but it also exposed the fault lines in the Colombo family. Capos who feared his influence moved quickly to consolidate power. Younger soldiers whispered of retribution, but the family hierarchy demanded order. Fear overrode vengeance. Politically, Spider's assassination rippled through the corridors he had infiltrated. Contractors grew cautious, councilmen reconsidered their alliances, and law enforcement sensed an opportunity to probe deeper. Yet no one could touch the orchestrators. They were careful, deliberate, invisible. Spider's death was clean, surgical, and ultimately unavoidable. For those who knew him, the image of Spider, charismatic, calculating, deadly in intellect, was burned into memory. The man who had navigated streets, backrooms, and political offices with unmatched foresight was gone, a victim not of random violence but of betrayal, ambition, and the unforgiving rules of organized crime. In Bensonhurst, the snow melted into the sidewalks, erasing footprints but leaving a permanent void. Spider Lombardo's web of influence, once so intricate, collapsed in a single, calculated moment. Spider Lombardo's murder sent shockwaves through Brooklyn and beyond. Within the Colombo family, the power vacuum ignited a silent scramble. Capos who had resented Spider's political ambition moved swiftly to reassert control. Soldiers and associates, uncertain who to trust, tightened alliances with the old guard. Fear, more than loyalty, became the glue that held the family together. Politically, Spider's absence was felt immediately. Contractors who had once been confident in the protection of his influence now hesitated. Corruption that Spider had monitored and subtly controlled began to shift into chaos. City officials, previously complicit, noticed anomalies in contracts and payments. Investigators sensed opportunity, though the true depth of Spider's knowledge remained hidden. Law enforcement followed leads, piecing together Spider's movements, but the Mafia's silence and intimidation ensured the true perpetrators remained unseen. Rumors spread. Some whispered that his death was revenge. Others claimed it was a warning to any who dared step beyond traditional boundaries. Hollywood, of course, would later simplify Spider's story, portraying him as just another ambitious mobster. The truth, far more intricate, remained obscured. Within the family, the psychological impact lingered. Men who had once relied on Spider's guidance realized how fragile power truly was. The web he had woven, alliances, intelligence, political leverage, unraveled quickly, leaving gaps that rivals and enemies were eager to exploit. Some soldiers left the streets entirely, fearing they could be next. Others hardened, determined to survive in the same brutal system that had claimed Spider. For Bensonhurst, the neighborhood life returned to its rhythm, but with a subtle, lingering tension. Families whispered warnings to their children. Street corners, once Spider's domain, felt emptier, more cautious. His legacy was not glory, but a stark reminder. Knowledge, influence, and ambition in organized crime are double-edged swords. Spider Lombardo was gone, but the ripples of his life, and his death, reached far beyond the block he called home. The Colombo family endured, but a chapter of ambition and betrayal had closed, leaving behind a cautionary tale of power, loyalty, and the cost of insight in a world ruled by fear. Spider Lombardo's story is more than a tale of betrayal and murder. It is a study of power, ambition, and the delicate balance between knowledge and survival. He was a man who saw the threads that connected streets, family, and politics, and for that, he paid the ultimate price. Organized crime, as Spider knew, is not merely about money or territory. It is a complex ecosystem where loyalty is transactional, fear is currency, and ambition can either elevate or destroy. Spider's rise illustrates the paradox. Intelligence and foresight can protect a man, but they can also mark him as a target. Knowledge in the Mafia is never neutral. It is both weapon and liability. His murder forces reflection on a broader truth. The structures of power, whether in government, business, or crime, are fragile and easily corrupted. Spider's life bridged worlds that are rarely examined together: the public facade of law and order, and the private machinery of coercion and manipulation. His story exposes the uncomfortable reality that those who seek to control both often navigate perilous moral terrain, with few allies and even fewer guarantees. And yet, there is a haunting symmetry to Spider's fate. He returned to his apartment on a December night, a space that once offered refuge, only to meet death at the hands of those he trusted. Life in the underworld is circular. The same streets that shape ambition ultimately deliver judgment. Spider's web of influence collapsed where it began, at home, in the shadows, where power meets vulnerability. In the end, the story of Spider Lombardo is a mirror. It asks us, what is the cost of knowledge? What is the price of ambition in a world governed by fear? And perhaps most chillingly, in systems built on secrecy and control, is survival ever more than a temporary illusion? Spider's life, his rise, and his death remind us that power, however cleverly wielded, always casts a shadow. And in that shadow, history, myth, and reality intertwine, leaving a legacy that is as instructive as it is tragic.